everyone is now living in Trump world, and they're having to kind of adapt to that. Things could change very quickly. Trump could also be a pretty dangerous antagonist. The thing about Putin is essentially he's an opportunist. He creates fairly chaotic situations which will throw up a whole variety of different opportunities, and he'll decide there and then which to follow through with. Morality and international law says the Russians have to leave Ukraine, return all the prisoners of war, pay reparation. Well, that's fine, but unfortunately the world does not necessarily work that way.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes. I am delighted to be joined today by Professor Mark Galeotti, a prolific author on all things Russia, most recent book, Forged in War. Mark, welcome.
Good to be here.
Now, Mark, it feels as if the world is changing almost by the minute, especially when it comes to questions around Russia, Ukraine and the US. At the moment we're in, it's looking like Putin has been offered a peace deal. Ukraine has agreed to it, but we don't know what Russia is going to, whether it's going to accept it, whether it's going to drown it out in amendments or nitpicking. What do you make of the current state of play at the moment?
Well, I mean, the first point to make is actually the perverse environment in which everyone is now living in Trump world. And they're having to kind of adapt to that. And the Ukrainians, they certainly got a battering, clearly from Trump's point of view, to make them realize that as far as he's concerned, obviously they would differ, but as far as he's concerned, they're a bought and paid for vassal state and need to know their place. And the Russians, what's interesting is, up to now, they have been offered all these unexpected goodies and promises from Trump, precisely to bring Putin to the table. But there is also this awkward understanding that actually things could change very quickly, and that Trump could also be a pretty dangerous antagonist for them. And I think it is clear that the Russians are trying to work out how they can get the best deal possible, best circumstances possible, without running the risk of antagonizing Trump. And this is definitely going to push Putin's skills as a Trump wrangler, which have been demonstrated to be pretty impressive, it has to be said, but nonetheless really will tax those skills. And what the outcome is going to be, look, I'd love to be able to confidently give you some kind of assessment, but the truth of the matter is we have no idea.
And, you talked about Putin being a Trump wrangler. Trump is often accused of being purely a stooge for Putin, a Russian asset. Do you think that is really borne out by what's happening when you look, closer at the detail?
No, I mean, there is a lot of nonsense, and in part because it's so much easier to be able to blame Putin for everything that you don't like, whether we're talking about Brexit or Trump's election or whatever, that sort of big bad bogeyman over in the East, rather than understand that these are results of domestic factors. Now, in Trump's case, he obviously doesn't help himself in the sense of he does have this strange fanboyishness about Putin. But in fairness, Trump essentially has never met an autocrat he doesn't like. And in part, it's precisely because I think there is, and this means one wandering into the realms of psychoanalysis of Trump, which is certainly not something I want to do. But, he does seem to have this desire to be in the strongman club, to be seen of as a tough guy. But it's also because they share with him a common view of the world, which is essentially that the world is shaped by a relative handful of charismatic leaders and powerful countries, and that the lot of the rest of the countries is essentially just who gets to give them orders. So in some ways, I think it's also that actually Trump finds a common language almost with people like Putin, and to a degree Xi in China and Erdogan in Turkey and so forth. So I think that explains a lot. This is a man who doesn't care about the old traditions. This is a man who doesn't care about the understandings and the sense of the self-imposed limitations on the United States. He regards himself as now the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated. And his job is to obviously have fun and elevate himself and get his Nobel Peace Prize, but also to maximize the value for his corporation.
And you could see some of that playing out in this proposed minerals deal, which is actually goes a lot deeper than minerals. Trump wants to use many of Ukraine's resources. What do you make of that gambit? I mean, Ukraine seems to have agreed to a watered down version of it, but it doesn't come with the security guarantees that Ukraine had asked for. What's your take on that side of things?
Yeah, I think this is a classic case of Trump not really looking too much into the detail, but also being all about selling the sizzle rather than the sausage. It's all about grandstanding. Because let's be honest, first of all, his claim that it provides implicit security guarantees because there'll be all these American interests and American workers and so forth on the ground, and Putin won't want to risk bombing them. Well, that's not really a factor, because it's going to take a long time before any American companies decide to actually invest in those kind of activities in what is still a wartime situation. Nothing else. Boring things like what with insurance situation. Secondly, many of these resources are actually in Russian-held areas. And thirdly, there's going to be a hell of a lot of upfront investment needed before they're accessible. So in some ways, this is a vaporware deal. It provides, in theory, potential substantial revenue for the United States. But it depends on circumstances that actually are at the moment so implausible, and, as I say, will require so much initial investment that we're talking about something that maybe is going to be really of value 5-10 years down the line.
So we've talked about what Trump wants. It's clear what the Ukrainians want, their national independence, which I think we can come on to in a minute. But what does Putin want out of this situation? What do you think he might hope to get out of negotiations, especially if he seems as if in a position where he's doing perhaps better in the war than in recent months and years?
Sure. Look, I think the thing about Putin is we have to realize he's not, in some this is another way in which he's similar to Trump. He doesn't have a clear strategy in the sense of a definite fixed end goal and a clear roadmap for how he's going to get to it. He has things that he wants, but essentially he's an opportunist. He creates fairly chaotic situations which will throw up a whole variety of different opportunities, and he'll decide there and then which to follow through with, and he can change his mind if he decides, no, actually this isn't working. So, the glib answer is, what does Putin want? The most he can possibly get. That said, one can distinguish between the things that are clearly his kind of core interests. He is not really going to abandon any of the occupied territories. Essentially, where Russian troops are going to be staying. And there's almost no way, short of a massive military sort of reversal, that can actually change that. Secondly, he is going to want to see some degree of sanctions relief. Now, he's probably realistic enough to know that it's not going to be an across-the-board thing. There will continue to be controls on investments in, for example, the Russian defense industrial complex, and also technologies which are going to be useful for military purposes. But he needs to have them not least be able, that way he can show the Russian population an elite. You see, they turned the screws, we resisted, and now they're unscrewing them again. And the third thing is, the most amorphous really, is some kind of limitations on the sovereignty of Ukraine. They've talked about, basically keeping its army limited to a small size, which would mean that Russia could always muscle in the future. They're very concerned about Ukraine not being allowed to join NATO, that kind of thing. Quite where the lines are, except on the NATO issue, I don't really know. I don't think it's clear. But, that will be his third ideal requirement, to feel that he's at least limited Ukraine. And I think that's probably going to be the one area where he's going to lose out.
And how is the war viewed in Russia? Obviously, there is this sort of propaganda story of this special military operation, the denazification of Ukraine. But that aside, do they see it as a proxy war with the West, for instance? I mean, what about ordinary people? Do they support the war? Do they not care? Do they hope it's see it as something over there? What's your take on that?
Obviously, it's very hard to actually do proper opinion polling in what is now an authoritarian, thuggish police state. But on the other hand, there are those polling agencies that have tried sort of clever sideways routes to assessing opinion. And what seems to emerge is, broadly speaking, that there's maybe a quarter of Russians who are broadly supportive of the war. That doesn't mean to say that they believe in war crimes and all that kind of thing, but they feel that they've imbued the propaganda that essentially this is a necessary war for Russia. There's about a similar amount, quarter, maybe a few more these days, who are opposed to the war. And again, they're not out protesting, because to do that gets you clubbed to the ground by the police and dragged off to prison or whatever else. But nonetheless, they think this is a bad thing. That means you've basically got a chunk of the population, a half or a little bit less than a half, who don't really know what to believe. And they are trying not really to think about it. I mean, for me, one of the fascinating statistics is viewership figures for TV news has really dropped off a cliff. Instead, what are they watching? They're watching rom-coms. They're watching science fiction. They're watching anything that is escapism. So in some ways, they actually would like to just simply ignore the war as far as they can. They know it's there. So broadly speaking, I mean, obviously how you parse that, is it 3/4 oppose the war or are not supportive of it? Or is it 3/4 don't oppose it? Oh, you can play different games. But what is clear is that there is not a majority for the war. Over 70% have said that if Putin signs a peace deal, they will be glad about that, and they don't really care what the peace deal is as long as Putin signs it. But of course, that doesn't mean saying they necessarily want Russia to lose. I mean, still there's patriotism that you may think you're in a silly war, but you still don't want your soldiers to die. You don't want your country humiliated. So I think at the moment, things are not so bad for most Russians. Yes, their inflation is quite high, especially in terms of food. There is always a kind of concern about whether there'll be another mobilization. I mean, at the moment, they're still fueling this war machine with volunteers, attracted by very, very generous payments. But, there is concern about the longer term. So I think most people would like the war to end. But the question is, on what terms?
Yeah. And would it be fair to say that Russia is moving towards more of a war footing to reorganize society and the economy around, as if the war, in anticipation of the war perhaps going along a lot longer than, say, Trump is expecting?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, the country is already on a war footing in that respect. And that's one of the reasons why sanctions, which, remember, in the first weeks and months of the war, the sanctions hawks were saying, look, this is going to bring Russia, its economy crashing down, the Kremlin on its knees within a matter of months. And of course, it didn't happen, because that's not how sanctions work, especially not for authoritarian regimes that can absolutely shift capacity by decree rather than having to wait for judicial reviews or whatever else. And so, we have certainly within the economy, largely a sort of war-fighting economy, but there's still a clear desire by the Kremlin to maintain all the sort of trappings of civilian life. Remember, although Putin says that Russia is in a war with the West, nonetheless, this is not a kind of total war. And he knows that to keep the Russian people on side, there still has to be, McDonald's may have left, but there is a McDonald's clone that, well, according to my stepdaughter, is actually every bit as good, if not better than McDonald's or whatever. So there is that. Now, the issue is that maybe by next year, actually, it's going to be harder and harder to keep a balance between the two. That's when the really tough guns versus butter decisions need to be made. And if the war is still raging next year, then almost certainly Putin will obviously opt for guns, not butter, and people's lives will start to get tougher. But actually, one of the surprises of this war has been quite how resilient the Russian economy has been, in part because they've actually got, one has to recognise, a lot of very competent technocrats managing it.
And what is the role of, say, ultra-nationalists in Russia? I mean, they've been big cheerleaders for the war. Is Putin perhaps, would he be worried about a reaction from them if he were to sign perhaps a peace deal that they would see as too hasty?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the considerations. I mean, the ultra-nationalists, the real sort of basically people who say that until Russian tanks roll into Kyiv, this war isn't over and so forth. I mean, they are a relatively small but very vocal minority. But first of all, they are disproportionately worrying for Putin because they're disproportionately represented in the security apparatus, the police, the military, and otherwise the guys with guns, and the guys on whom Putin would have to rely in the case of a real crisis. And the second reason why is they may not be that significant now, but if and when this war ends, there will be hundreds of thousands of Russians coming home from the war, many of them deeply scarred by the experience. Again, if we look at past experiences, 30 to 35% are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder in some form or another, into a country that isn't really ready for them. There aren't the treatment provisions. There may well not be the job opportunities in the places they live and so forth. There's going to be a lot of disillusioned people who are thinking, well, why? What was this about? Did we really win? And the risk for Putin is that the nationalists are going to be able to capture a lot of those disillusioned, angry, and sort of battle-trained supporters. Again, I don't want to raise too apocalyptic a fear. I don't think we're talking about civil wars and such like. But if we look at what happened after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1988, if we look at what happened after the two very vicious Chechen wars inside Russia, you get this kind of nationalist backlash. And that, I think, does worry Putin.
And is there, there's no official opposition, obviously, in Russia, really. Many of the dissidents are abroad. But we have also seen, some dissent within the ranks or within, the oligarchy. Thinking just about Pogrom, who you wrote a book on as well, who is obviously dead. But is there the potential for more sort of stirrings of revolt from perhaps even within the ranks of the Kremlin or within Putin's circle?
We're not talking about a situation where we can see likelihood of, say, Putin being toppled by a coup, not least because the security apparatus is sufficiently competent, and there are all sorts of different agencies whose role is essentially to watch each other. So the big problem with a coup is always what's called the first mover problem. In other words, who starts the conversation? Who can you risk chatting to and saying we need to do something? Instead, the issue is the growing, what we could think of as protest potential in the country, just people who are fed up. At the moment, they're not doing anything about it necessarily, though an interesting factoid is that since the start of the war, the level of environmental protests in Russia has skyrocketed. And it's not like the environment has suddenly got worse or that Russians have got a lot more green. It's that's one of the few areas of sanctioned protest. You can't go out and protest against the war. But if you're protesting on environmental issues, and particularly if you're talking about very specific local ones, so you're not just talking about government policy, but this particular nature reserve that is threatened, or this rubbish tip that is leaching nastiness into the water table, that's still allowed. And I think this is a symptom of the fact that you have in people in society who they want their voices to be heard. They know that they can't really do anything about the big issues, but they still want to feel that they're doing something. And certainly from the point of view of the security apparatus, the Federal Security Service, which is the sort of the KGB follow-on and so forth, their big nightmare is precisely that something happened, some black swan event, which, maybe it's sort of the closing of massive factories somewhere, or, again, probably economic issues, triggers some kind of protests. The local police aren't able to or don't want to actually suppress it, and that it can spread very quickly. Because, as I said, that sense of kind of a protest potential that is lurking underneath this rather conformist surface. So, yes, nothing imminent's likely, but there are signs that Russians have not just simply given up their autonomy.
And returning to the international sphere, is there a danger of Ukraine essentially being strong-armed into a bad peace, but also might there perhaps be some opportunities that we might not expect to come out of these negotiations?
Yeah, obviously the question is, what is a bad peace? Some people say any peace is good. That's clearly not the case. I think the difficulty is that in the circumstances, given the limits to which the West is willing to engage itself, essentially the only real option is a fairly bad peace, which would give essentially Russia about 20% of Ukraine's territory, and to put it very bluntly, largely get away with it. You'll probably lose all the $300 billion worth of funds which are currently frozen in the West, which will be used to help rebuild Ukraine. But, essentially, Russia would cope. The question is, of course, what kind of Ukraine the remaining rump country is. Is it genuinely free to turn towards Europe? I mean, it said it wants to join the European Union. And in fact, ironically, the Russians have said they have no problem with that. Is it able to build up its own military so that it's going to be secure from any future invasions? All that kind of thing. That's very much a play for. And one of my big concerns is that there's already a bit of a stab in the back myth emerging in Ukraine. This claim that, well, the West just only gave us the weapons to continue the war, not enough to actually win it. It's not really true, to be honest. But nonetheless, it's a pervasive view. And if we find that Ukraine is not then properly secured, properly protected, doesn't have the kind of reconstruction assistance that's needed, we could get actually a sort of quite an anti-Western feeling. I mean, I was speaking to someone I know who works in Kiev, who was saying that they were very shocked because they heard from one of their close friends who's very kind of Western looking, travelled a lot and so forth, who said, look, we knew the Russians were our enemies, but we thought the Europeans were our friends. It's almost like, well, we didn't expect anything better from the Russians, but we did expect better from the Europeans. So there are political dangers ahead if, as is all too common the case, when the shooting stops, we lose our focus on Ukraine and stop caring.
And finally, is there anything that you think that the sort of conversation that's happening in the West, whether that's in the media or via our politicians, what are they missing about Russia and Ukraine? Are the things they're getting wrong, or are the things they're just complete factors that are being overlooked in your view?
I think one of the biggest issues, and this has frankly been something from the beginning of the conflict, is we never sat down to define our terms, which sounds like a very, very academic kind of way of looking at it. But we talk easily about a Ukrainian victory. What does that mean? Does that mean every single Russian soldier pushed off every single square centimetre of Ukraine? Because that was always very, very unlikely to happen. And in and of itself doesn't end the war. It just moves the front line to the national border. We talk about, Putin must fail. Well, again, what does fail mean? We have all these empty mantras, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Support as long as it takes. As long as it takes to do what? This is, I think, has been one of the really striking things about this is a war which has been defined more than anything else by sound bites and by social media. And as a result, we and the Ukrainians have been badly served because we never have really tried to sit down and say, well, what do we think we would like? I mean, obviously, morality and international law says the Russians have to leave Ukraine, return all the prisoners of war, pay reparations. Well, that's fine. But unfortunately, the world does not necessarily work that way. We've never really sit down and say, okay, well, what do we think is plausible and credible, and what are we willing to do about it? And as a result, policy has been, and continues to be, deeply flabby. And if there's one thing that one must acknowledge about Donald Trump, is that he has been willing to challenge a lot of these sacred cows. I mean, even, for example, on the issue of NATO membership. We all talk about, Ukraine's NATO membership is irreversible. No one's actually honest about the fact that irreversible means we're never going to rule it out, but don't expect it anytime soon. The fact of the matter is that there are a number of NATO members. And remember, a decision on a new member has to be, something that everyone agrees on. But nonetheless, there's a number of countries which were not willing to accept NATO membership for Ukraine anytime soon, because that would basically mean running the risk that they'd actually be required essentially to fight a war with Russia. But we were never honest about this. So I think this is it. I think that for me is the key thing, having an honest discussion in which you recognise that there's going to be difference of opinions. This war looks very different from Warsaw than from Rome. But nonetheless, as a result, we just basically sat down and relied on empty and flabby cliches that really didn't help anyone.
Mark Galeotti, thank you very much.